Hello friends, it is me, JJ. I haven't moved that much since the last time you saw me. My post-travel isolation is now entering day 8. You can maybe tell that I've sort of rearranged things a little bit. Anyway, as part of the escalating situation, President Trump did this the other day.
To unleash the full power of the federal government in this effort today, I am officially declaring a national emergency. Two very big words.
But just how very big are those words, relatively speaking? While I think we can all agree that the current coronavirus pandemic does indeed qualify as a national emergency, did you know that the United States is already under 34 other different states of national emergency? So in the US system of government, the Congress has the power to grant the president certain emergency powers at times of national crisis. The current system for this was established in 1976 when Congress passed something known as the National Emergencies Act, which was signed into law by President Gerald R. Ford. You can currently find it in Chapter 34 in Title 50 of the US Code. The way it works is that when the president determines that the security, economic, or social conditions of America, or indeed the wider world, have risen to some level of unprecedented crisis, he can proclaim a national emergency, and then he gets to tap into any of the 100 emergency presidential powers that the Congress has stuck in the US Code over the years. Now, in theory, Subchapter 2 of the National Emergencies Act says that 6 months after a president proclaims a national emergency, the Congress must convene to decide whether or not to end or continue that state of national emergency. But in practice, the Congress never actually does this. In fact, according to this 2019 article in The Atlantic, in the over 40 years that the National Emergencies Act has been on the books, the Congress has literally never met even once to re-examine any national emergency a president has declared. And through a loophole in the law, this means that these states of emergency continue forever, at least so long as the presidents keep reproclaiming them year after year, which most presidents do. The Brennan Center for Justice, a division of New York University, keeps a running tab of how many national emergencies the various presidents have proclaimed since 1976. The current total is 64. 2 by President Carter, 6 by President Reagan, 5 by President Bush, 17 by President Clinton, 14 by the other President Bush, 12 by President Obama, and 8 by President Trump. Now, about half of these declarations have been rescinded, not by Congress, never by Congress, no, by other presidents. But 35 of them have never been rescinded because no president has ever seen any reason to. Which means that America is still technically in 35 different states of national emergency right now. And what are those 35? Well, let's see if we can get through them all. In November of 1979, loyalists to the new Islamic fundamentalist government in Iran took several dozen Americans hostage at the US Embassy in Tehran. In response, President Jimmy Carter proclaimed a national emergency in order to freeze any Iranian government assets being held in US banks. Of course, in the 40 years since then, a lot of that money has gradually been unfrozen and given back to the Iranians, including on Obama's infamous pallet. In fact, there is even an official American-Iranian Asset Restoration Tribunal now, but still a national emergency. Alright, now let's flash forward to November of 1994. The Cold War is over, and America turns its eyes to a new threat: rogue states acquiring weapons of mass destruction. In November of 1994, President Bill Clinton thus proclaimed a national emergency in order to create some new regulations to stop the proliferation of WMDs. This included prohibiting foreigners from buying things from America that could be used to make WMDs, and imposing financial punishments on any country determined to have an active WMD program. These powers continue to be used by presidents to this day because, unfortunately, despite Bill Clinton's best efforts, WMD proliferation very much continues. In March of 1995, President Clinton proclaimed a national emergency in order to stop American companies from buying Iranian oil. Clinton said this was a way the US could help financially hurt the Iranian regime and stop it from sponsoring terrorism around the world, US relations having not improved much since the Carter years. A few months after that, Clinton proclaimed another national emergency, this time to freeze the US assets of the infamous Cali drug cartel of Colombia. At the time, the Cali cartel were considered responsible for about 80% of the cocaine in the US. Since then, the Cali cartel has been broken up and all of its top guys are in jail, but this national emergency remains on the books just the same. It is now used as a pretext for freezing the US assets of drug traffickers in general. In February of 1996, Cuban-American relations hit a new low. The Cuban Air Force shot down 2 small American civilian planes, which were being piloted by Cuban-American anti-Castro activists who were distributing anti-Castro leaflets over Cuba. President Clinton thus proclaimed a national emergency in order to make a new rule that said that US ships could not enter Cuban waters without first getting US government approval. This rule was softened a bit during the Obama administration, but has since been toughened back up under Trump. Sudan continued to spiral into an increasingly vicious Islamic dictatorship throughout the 1990s under the leadership of the notorious General Bashir. Clinton declared a national emergency in order to impose sanctions on members of his regime. Now, sanctions is a word you're going to be hearing a lot today because it is by far the most common emergency power that presidents use. But what are sanctions? Basically, during a national emergency, a president can pick out any foreigner or foreign organization and freeze any US bank assets they might have, prohibit Americans from doing any business with them, and if it's a person, ban them from ever coming to the United States. By the way, General Bashir was actually overthrown last year, but this state of emergency against his regime remains in place. Okay, now we are on to a new president, George W. Bush. In the late 1990s, there was a terrible civil war in the former Yugoslavia, which ended with the 1999 signing of the Dayton Accords. In 2001, President Bush proclaimed a national emergency in order to impose sanctions on various terrorists who were seen as undermining the fragile peace in that part of the world. Okay, so this is a kind of unique one. US trade law has always had special rules that require Americans to get special permission from the US government before you can sell certain forms of very advanced US technology, like supercomputers, to people in other countries. In 2001, the laws governing this expired, and since Congress didn't pass a new law, President Bush proclaimed a national emergency to just keep all of the rules of the expired law in place. And Congress never did pass a new law, so to this day, the rules governing the export of advanced US technology remain under presidential control. On September 11th, 2001, there was a massive terrorist attack in the United States led by Islamic fundamentalists. 3 days later, on September 14th, President Bush proclaimed a national emergency and evoked all of the emergency war powers granted to the president under the various military-related sections of the US Code. Now, the ways that the Bush administration behaved in the aftermath of 9/11 is obviously this huge and very controversial topic. We don't have time to get into all of that now, but suffice it to say that the September 14th national emergency was probably the most consequential of any of the ones we're going to talk about today. The US has basically been in a permanent state of war footing ever since. 2 weeks after September 11th, President Bush proclaimed a different national emergency in order to impose sanctions on a bunch of Islamic terrorist groups. During the early 2000s, the rule of Zimbabwe's longtime dictator, Robert Mugabe, grew even more vicious and corrupt. President Bush proclaimed a national emergency in 2003 in order to impose sanctions on Mugabe and friends. This declaration remains in place even though Mugabe was overthrown in 2017. In the spring of 2003, the US invaded Iraq and overthrew the regime of dictator Saddam Hussein. The entire Iraqi government was then reconstructed under US and UN authority. And one of the reforms was to create something called the Development Fund for Iraq, which was basically the new Iraqi government's budget. It was mostly funded through seized assets belonging to the old regime, like profits made from the selling of oil or the personal property of Saddam's inner circle. Anyway, in order to prevent any of this from being challenged in the courts, in May of 2003, President Bush proclaimed a national emergency in order to give the Iraqi Development Fund legal immunity as it went about its business. In 2014, President Obama suspended that immunity, but the American government is still helping the Iraqis reclaim assets from the Saddam years to this day. After the overthrow of Saddam Hussein, the Bush administration started to really tighten the screws on the government in Syria, in what many saw as being a prelude to an invasion of that country too. In 2004, Bush proclaimed a national emergency to basically ban all American trade and travel with Syria, and impose a bunch of sanctions as well. As Syria has only become a more infamous country since then, a lot of these rules have since been tightened up. Saying Syria is triggering Siri. A big part of the Bush administration's foreign policy philosophy was that the US should punish dictatorships wherever they can be found. Accordingly, between 2006 and 2008, President Bush proclaimed 4 different states of national emergency in order to impose sanctions on the regimes in Belarus, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Lebanon, and North Korea. The new administration of President Barack Obama continued this trend, declaring a national emergency in 2010 in order to impose sanctions on Somalia, and in 2011, Libya. Though in the case of Libya, sanctioning the regime of Colonel Gaddafi was part of a growing escalation of tension between Libya and the West that eventually culminated in Western airstrikes against the country and the overthrow and death of Colonel Gaddafi himself. In 2016, President Obama revised this emergency declaration to make it apply to the various terrorist groups who had taken over Libya in the aftermath of Gaddafi's downfall. Alrighty, more than halfway done. The Obama administration was keen to make a crackdown on international organized crime one of the hallmarks of their justice agenda. Accordingly, in 2011, President Obama proclaimed a national emergency in order to impose sanctions on the following foreign gangs: the Brothers Circle, the Camorra, Los Zetas, and the Yakuza. In 2011, the so-called Arab Spring broke out, which saw mass public uprisings against various Middle Eastern dictators. One of the various regimes targeted was the president of Yemen, who in 2012 agreed to step down, and the new guy promised to herald a transition to democracy. Obama proclaimed an unusual national emergency around this time, not to sanction anyone specifically, but to reserve the right to sanction anyone that they determined to be threatening the peace, security, or stability of Yemen. This remarkably open-ended decree continues to be useful as the Yemenis continue to wait for that promised peace, security, and stability to arrive. In the spring of 2014, tensions rose between the government of Ukraine and various Russian-backed militia groups over control of the Crimean region. As Ukraine was a US ally, on March 6, 2014, President Obama proclaimed a national emergency in order to impose sanctions on various Russian troublemakers. The Sudanese civil war, we were talking about several national emergencies ago, continued into 2014, though by this point it had evolved into something closer to a conventional war by 2 separate countries, regular Sudan and the newly independent South Sudan. America had supported the independence of South Sudan, so as a result, President Obama proclaimed a national emergency in order to sanction various North regime people who were seen as undermining the sovereignty of that new country. The Central African Republic was also in the midst of a terrible civil war in 2014. Another national emergency was proclaimed by Obama, and yet more people were sanctioned. Alright, Venezuela. Lots of bad guys there too. More sanctions. In April of 2015, the Obama administration proclaimed another national emergency in order to impose yet more sanctions. But get this time it wasn't about some foreign dictator or gangster or civil war. Instead, the administration had decided to crack down on cybercrime, like hacking, identity theft, that sort of thing. This national emergency was a bit like the Yemen one in that it didn't sanction anyone specifically, but rather gave the presidency the authority to sanction anyone in the future that it deemed to be involved in cyber criminal activities anywhere in the world. This national emergency wasn't proclaimed in specific response to any particular event, but it did come just a couple months after that infamous Sony Pictures hack of late 2014. If you remember that. How many Americans do you think know or care about the small East African nation of Burundi? Well, in November of 2015, President Obama said that the situation over there constituted a national emergency, and he sanctioned 4 people over it. In December of 2017, freshly elected President Donald J. Trump proclaimed a national emergency in order to sanction a real diverse bunch of randos from all over the world. These were people in countries ranging from Burma to Uzbekistan who were deemed to have been involved in either serious human rights abuses or serious corruption in some way. But Trump did not come up with this motley list himself. Congress was actually getting increasingly tired of being left out of the loop when it came to international sanctions. So in 2016, they passed something known as the Global Magnitsky Act, which allows Congress to nominate to the president people who they think should be sanctioned. And sanctioned they were. So, there was obviously a lot of controversy about alleged Russian meddling in the 2016 US presidential election, and even though President Trump was infamously skeptical of these charges, in September of 2018, he proclaimed a national emergency over it anyway. This decree requires the US government to do a thorough investigation of any alleged foreign meddling in a US election shortly after that election ends. And if any proof of foreign meddling is found, the president shall impose upon the guilty party, say it with me, sanctions. In 2018, Trump sanctioned the government of Nicaragua. It was a national emergency. I'm sure you remember where you were at the time. Alright, so here is Trump's most famous national emergency of all. His 2019 declaration of a national emergency at the Mexican border. Trump has obviously made a big deal about illegal Mexican immigration to the United States since day one.
They're sending people that have lots of problems.
But he has also had a lot of trouble fulfilling his signature campaign promise on this front, building the wall. Specifically, there has always been a lot of challenges involving who will pay for it. But by proclaiming a national emergency and evoking emergency military powers specifically, Trump gained the ability to redirect parts of the Pentagon budget and use it for wall construction instead. This was actually the first time since 9/11 that any president had evoked military powers as part of their national emergency, although in this case it was really more of a budget thing. Man, remember the border wall debate? It all seems so quaint now. In May of 2019, President Trump proclaimed a national emergency in order to prevent the Huawei Corporation from doing business in the US. Well, not literally. It was actually just a declaration giving the Commerce Department the power to block any foreign tech company that the president deemed to be a national security threat. But people could read between the lines. A few months later, President Trump proclaimed a national emergency in order to impose sanctions on anyone seen to be contributing to the unrest in the nation of Mali. In October of 2019, Trump withdrew all US forces from northern Syria, and Turkey invaded shortly after. Trump then proclaimed a national emergency and imposed sanctions on members of the Turkish government in response. It certainly made his meeting with the president of Turkey in the White House the next week a little bit awkward. And then this week we got national emergency number 35 in response to the coronavirus. A crisis almost as scary as that Burundi thing. Anyway, hope you enjoyed this video. Doing all of this research was a fun way to keep myself entertained in this grim quarantine. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and let me know if you have any other ideas for videos that you think would make for good watch-ins in this difficult time.